First of all, welcome. I just want to say that these events are always the highlights of my summer, in part because of the smart people I get a chance to sit down and talk with, but also the smart people that I get a chance to work with who are part of the festival. Also, the last 2 years, we've held our ideas conversation in this building, the auditorium of the Yale Center for British Art, which is one of the most beautiful and important and impeccably restored buildings of mid-century modern architecture in America. It was designed, of course, by the great Louis Kahn. This building and its companion building across the street, the Yale Art Gallery, are two gems of not just New Haven, but of America, and we're very, very lucky to have them here and to be sitting in this room. I want to thank Chad Herzog and Katrina Olson and the entire festival crew in advance. Thanks also to the producer of my program Next, Andrew Moraskin, who is here taping. Our intern, Carmen Baskoff, will be taking pictures of some of you, at least of us. She'll tell you if she's taking a picture of you. And our executive producer, Katie Tolarski. Last year's election in 2016, and I'm sure you might agree, was pretty exhausting for a lot of reasons, not the least of which was the endless stream of narratives trying to explain the motivation of voters who, to be frank, seemed pretty pissed off. They were upset about the quality of their jobs, or maybe that they didn't have jobs, or that those jobs had been sent overseas, or that those jobs had been taken by someone who is here illegally. Others were upset about the power imbalance in our country, about Wall Street, about the 1%ers who just don't understand what real Americans' lives are like. When a reporter or a pollster would ask them about those fears and concerns, it played out over and over again. You'd hear a one-word answer. They'd say, it's about the economy. About 84% of voters said the economy was the #1 issue on their minds. But that word, as former FBI Director Jim Comey might say, has some fuzz on it. When people say the economy, do they mean jobs? Do they mean my job? Do they mean economic growth, whatever that means? Do they mean my kids' future? Do they mean the American dream of home ownership? Luckily, one of our panelists today, the Nobel Prize-winning economist Robert Shiller from Yale, has a framework that might just help us. And, you know, it's nice to do a job like this in Connecticut because my producer, Katie, can actually call up a guy like Robert Shiller and say, hey, you want to come do a thing at Yale? And it's like, sure, why not? I'll walk down the street. So it's fantastic to have you here. And I want to get to an awful lot of things that you've been writing about in terms of narrative economics in just a moment. But just to give you a primer here, in a paper that he presented in January of this year, while the rest of us were considering President Trump's very uplifting American carnage speech, Shiller wrote, the human brain has always been highly tuned toward narratives, whether factual or not, to justify ongoing actions, even such basic actions as spending and investing. Stories motivate and connect activities to deeply felt values and needs. Now, of course, interestingly, in the months following both the Shiller and Trump speeches, the news media has been dominated by, well, almost everything other than a deep national discussion about what this fuzzy economy is all about. Russia, collusion, conflict, crowd size, travel bans, wiretapping, a lot else. Very little, though, about the narratives that those Pennsylvania coal miners and Ohio auto workers and the 99%ers you saw out here on the green in New Haven, all those things that they were trying to tell us. Our other panelist here tries to find those stories to tell. He's Dan Haar. He's a columnist for the Hartford Courant. Welcome, Dan. Thanks for being here.
I'm busy calculating the president's win share based on that introduction. It's not so easy.
A little inside baseball humor. Yeah. So I want to start before I get too deep into this idea of narrative economics, and I do want to tell our crowd that maybe with about a half hour left, we're going to open this up to questions from the audience, and we're going to have people here with floating microphones. So just like in class, you can hold up your hand and we'll try to get you a microphone and get to as many as we can. I want to ask you first, Robert Shiller, when you hear someone talk about the economy, what do you think they're talking about? And what do you think the economy is?
Well, the term the economy, it goes back to some ancient Greece. It means household management or something. The meaning has changed over time, but it seems now to refer, when you say it's the economy, stupid, it seems like it's some amoral force like the weather that affects all of us and we don't necessarily understand how it's affecting us. I'm thinking of even the election results. Ray Fair here at Yale has a model of voters that predicts that elections really depend on the unemployment and inflation and economic growth that was just experienced. Not what all they say doesn't matter. So he's kind of the apotheosis of this idea that the economy is a force in our lives.
But that the term, the economy, you said it's the economy stupid. This is famously, of course, James Carville, who worked for Bill Clinton, said it back in the heyday of the early Clintonian times. I guess the question is, did we talk about the economy in the same way before he said that?
So I did a Ngram search for the phrase the economy. And I found that it was never used as we use it now until after the Great Depression. I think of the Great Depression as the great narrative that has shaped our thinking. Other terms appeared in response to your prodding. I looked up healthy economy. Nobody ever said healthy economy until after the Great Depression. So what did they think? Yeah, there were economic events before. What were they thinking? Well, they didn't attribute it to the economy. So think of Jay Gould in the mid-19th century. He caused a financial panic, but he was a crook. Okay, so they'll blame it on crooks. They used to use the word confidence, and they thought they needed leadership, but it wasn't the economy. So J.P. Morgan, after the panic of 1907, he got all the bankers together, and using his leadership, he got them to buy, and the stock market decline was arrested. So it needed some kind of heroism or leadership or greatness.
But these are individual actors. This isn't this amorphous force that's washing over us.
That's
we can't
another
control.
interesting thing. You won't find references to stock price indices before the Great Depression. They didn't, or hardly ever in the news. Now, the Dow Jones Industrial Average supposedly, in fact, I believe, did start in the 1890s. But go search in old newspapers for any mention of that. Nobody mentioned it. When you wrote an article about the stock market, you always talked about individual stocks. And the idea that the Dow Jones Industrial Average should be of any interest outside of academia or a few analysts was just totally foreign to them. They wanted to hear stories about real companies.
Well, stories about real companies, and that's one of the great fallacies, I think, of a lot of business reporting, Dan, is we talk about these numbers and what they might mean to our lives. We gloss over whether or not the story that's being told has any underlying basis in whether or not, the company's doing well. The stock price will go up and down based on a story that we're telling that particular day, but it really doesn't always have anything to do with whether or not the company's a good company doing good work.
No, my cousin was a student at Carnegie Mellon getting an MBA when he said, and I worked for, at the time, Tribune. I guess I work for a spinoff of Tribune now called Tronc, and it was a terrible company at the time. I won't say anything about what it is now, but
it's a wonderful company now.
It's a wonderful company. It's been in
really
bankruptcy for quite a while. Yeah. But he said, well, gee, Tribune, that's a really good company. I said, what in the world would make you say that? And he says, the stock has been way up, right? And this was before 06. It later collapsed into zero. And actually negative territory, and it's part of his perception. His perception was because the stock is doing well. But I want to go back to the Dow. I wonder whether it's because we were in simpler times. Certainly before the Federal Reserve was formed in 1913. I looked up the Dow yesterday because General Electric, or 2 days ago, has a new CEO coming in, and GE is the only original component of the Dow. The 12 original companies, I looked them up just for this purpose, for that purpose, were one electric company, electric utility, General Electric, and 10 commodities companies: cotton, leather, coal. There was a railroad, that's not a commodity, but a much simpler time. And I wonder whether the economy then, even though we didn't talk about it, maybe we didn't talk about it because it was easier to control, and now we talk about it because it is more like the weather.
I'd love a response to that. That's an interesting idea.
Well, the economy 100 years ago or 200 years ago was more agricultural. We have to remember we started out as a farming nation, and we didn't particularly aspire to own single-family homes. We aspired to a farm. That was the life. So the idea that the economy is unstable would just be, you could talk about farm prices, but that sounds more focused. What is the economy? They wouldn't have known what to make of it.
So then
And there's no unemployment on the farm, right?
So all these Dow components, which included cotton and all these commodities, start to become more complicated, starting with GE. And does that make the economy a more interesting subject to talk about, or does it make it, because it's this big force, and with the Depression we see a powerful force?
Yeah. The companies you talk about are very concrete.
Yes.
One product.
Yes. Right.
We know what they do. It's not difficult to compute an earnings statement for them. You look at their revenues and subtract their costs. There weren't any employee options or swaps or complicated thing. So as time went on, we got more and more abstract. There were conglomerates that produced many different things, and they would the value was harder to estimate. And so I think that's why maybe the economy became more.
But I'm wondering if that then leads into this bigger idea that I want to have you explain about narrative economics and the role this plays. In one way, you say that there's a narrative around great barons of the 19th century, people who had stories, and there were stories about those people. But also at that time, if you're talking about a simpler economy, it didn't really necessarily rely, the stock price didn't rely on the story that you told about the cotton company. If it was a hot summer, people might buy more cotton clothes as opposed to more wool clothes, and so you'd have more people buying cotton clothes. Now it's really hard to figure out what the inputs and the outputs are of any particular thing. So what you're saying is the stories are the inputs.
Well, I'm thinking back to Henry Ford. Remember him?
Not personally, no.
He was a story. In fact, my grandfather met him. Yeah. I never was allowed to forget that. But it was of no important occasion. But Henry Ford was inventive, and he appreciated the assembly line. He ran for the president, one of the businessmen candidates. And so I think it started to evolve into more of a story of American genius rather than cotton and coal. So that allows more fanciful thinking than there used to be.
So that fanciful thinking, it comes to this end here, where we have an economy that's maybe really hard to explain. So I mean, what has the study of narrative economics told you about how stories influence the actual economy, how it actually influences everything from Wall Street to, whether or not we're going to have a good year or not in my business this year?
I'm thinking that the economics profession is the least accepting of the importance of narratives. You look in journals of psychology, sociology, anthropology, political science, history. They all are way ahead of economics.
Medicine, you show up at the hospital and you tell a personal story.
Economists and I don't quite understand, I've been living in the econ profession all my professional life. They like to represent people as rational optimizers who look at data. And they like to talking about the stock market. When the stock market changes, they call that an innovation. Some of them do anyway. And the stock market is efficient. It's combining the information of everyone. And so whenever there's an innovation in stock prices upward, it's only for us to try to figure out what was the news about. And if we economists can't answer what it was about, we can always say, the market is smarter than anyone. I have to, in my humble, I can't be expected as a single human being to grasp what this movement meant. We'll find out eventually, maybe. So I think that's overdone. But I love my profession. I love economists, but I think we need to stay on track. And that means
we should stop listening to them.
And, well, see, the problem is it looks. I have to say it to economists. Storytelling looks flaky. That's what those newspaper people do, those news media people do.
Well, no, wait a minute. No, wait a minute. I'm not an economist, but I do play one on TV Tuesday mornings at 7:40 on Channel 61, and we do try to go find stories, and we are trying to be analytical. But you're right. We're not doing the level of long-term analysis. But I want to get to one thing that I noticed. In Greenwich. I was in Greenwich recently trying to find stories about whether people with enormous wealth are or are not leaving. And I came across a fellow, and this is now going to take us to the opposite end of the spectrum from Amalgamated Coal and Waterbury Brass, which were the cornerstones of industry in 1896. And this fellow is the market maker, or a market maker, in options and derivatives for the Case-Shiller Index. And for those of you who don't know, the Case-Shiller Index, developed by Professor Shiller and a fellow named Case, discerns the true changing prices of housing, not just based on median price sale, but based on, I don't want to go into it, neither do you. It attempts to get to the truth. So what this person is doing is he's making a market for people who are betting on up or down moves on the Case-Shiller Index, not directly, but as a derivative. They could bet double down, they could bet triple. And so is my question and my curiosity about this, is this really where we've come from amalgamated coal to derivatives in the Case-Shiller Index? Now, no insult meant to you, but it's a derivative of a derivative.
Well, I guess you could put it that way.
Yeah. So is it? I mean, is this is what the economy is about? And one of the reasons we like to talk about it, as I said before, we can't figure it out, and I certainly can't figure out what a derivative of the Case-Shiller Index would do in relation to the guy down the street, Joe Grab a Sandwich, right? That can't be connected to the economy that you and I know.
So let me give a little history to indexes. The most important economic index ever is the Consumer Price Index, which was also created in 1913, same year as the Fed, and it was designed to be used in contracts to protect people against inflation. So in other words, you would put into a labor contract or into a government, or even possibly into a government bond, that the payment would be increased if the Consumer Price Index goes up. And that made good sense to me. I thought that indices should be used to protect people against price movements. So that what I wanted when I worked with Case to develop a futures and options market in we're drifting from the original thing, but what I wanted to do was to help people protect themselves against declines in home value. And you could do that either directly in a futures or options by buying a put option on your house. But I didn't think most people would do that. We were hoping to lure insurance companies to issue home equity insurance to insure you against price declines. And we went to Hartford, by the way, and talked to Aetna people, and we weren't successful in getting them.
If you'd been successful, maybe they wouldn't be moving their headquarters.
That's a painful issue. I don't know if we want to get into that, but I read your column on that. The point is that insurance is an important part of our lives. We buy houses with no protection. We just saw in this financial crisis, millions of people were underwater after home prices declined. Why don't insurance companies put homeowners in their homeowners policy, put some kind of protection against price declines? They're putting it against fires, but fires are practically gone. We have better fire departments, better fire codes. That's 19th century. We should be protecting people against the market decline.
Is it too late for me to buy this?
So now I'm not discouraged that we haven't convinced an insurance company to do it yet, because these kinds of innovations occur over decades or centuries. And so I like to be part of the discourse, and I don't think that I have to have a product that's the market is ready for at the moment. But that's why we created a futures and options market at the Chicago Mercantile Exchange.
So actually, Dan's story there, and talking about it, and it gets me to one of the stories I want to talk about. So Dan was doing reporting about whether or not people are leaving Connecticut because of the environment here, or the economic conditions here. The stories that we hear are the taxes are too high, it's business unfriendly. There's a lot of reasons why people or business people are leaving the state. So I guess I'll ask you first, Dan Haar, and then I'd love to hear Professor Shiller on this, how much does that actually affect the real inputs and outputs? When people tell a story over and over again that Connecticut's a bad place to do business, it's very high cost. I mean, does that narrative actually substantively impact the actual economy?
I think it does. I think that Connecticut right now is, especially the Hartford area, much less so in Fairfield, and New Haven is in between those two in respect to how beaten down we've become in the national media. There were two stories this week alone, one in Bloomberg and one in the New York Times. There was a big story in the Wall Street Journal last week. The factors that they're writing about are true. It is true that Hartford is near filing for bankruptcy and will likely file if the state doesn't produce $50 million to fill a budget gap. It is true that Aetna is moving its headquarters. It is not true that it's all of a sudden a terrible place to live. It's also not true that Connecticut's lead as the richest state is slipping. I just looked up this afternoon, between 2010 and 2016, Connecticut's lead as the richest state went from 1.33 times the median, the national, to 1.47. Our lead is gaining. That means that all things being equal, rich people are not leaving. And so how do we tell that story? The answer is there's a little bit of both happening. Yes, there are some people leaving, but yes, conditions aren't so bad as to justify that leaving. So it's a bad tale.
Yeah.
I'm just going to quote a recent Robert Wright column, I don't know if you saw it, about the theory that some people express is that business will leave the high-tax, high-regulation states toward the low-tax, low-regulation state. So he said, well, if that's true, we should look at what states are low-tax and low-regulation. And it turns out these are less successful states. So he mentioned that the state of California, by the way, you've heard of Silicon Valley? Okay. We have to consider them a success, but they're high tax and high regulation.
Sure.
State. So people want to stay in these states because so something about the quality of business there. You're not fleeing. Most people don't flee taxes. They're looking at the whole picture of, and so the ambiance of a state is enhanced by those taxes as they're used and the regulations as they're applied.
And in some
it's
ways,
a long-run thing. It doesn't immediately. We might see Aetna leave Connecticut, but in the long run, we don't want to lose sight of our strength. And I don't think we can lure people by low taxes. Maybe in the
No, we're not
run.
going to win that battle.
But I also think on the other side, too, we have a couple of good examples, including, we'll say, the state of Kansas. They've been conducting a type of experiment there. If you could get a governor and a legislature all together and say, we're going to do all the things the conservatives ever said they ever wanted to do, cut taxes and slash regulations and cut down the size of government. And it turns out that this style, at least in Kansas, of trickle-down economics doesn't really work, and already they're having to backtrack on some of these plans. I'm wondering, Robert Shiller, if part of it is that is also driven by a type of narrative. There really seemingly was not, by the Kansas legislature and governor, an attempt to really look at the inputs of the economy and what the government might need to do to help Kansas grow, but it was about telling a story. We're going to be a low-tax state. Right. We're going to be a state with not a whole lot of regulation, and that's how we're going to succeed.
Well, I've heard of this Kansas example. I'll give another example of Russia. I believe, I'm not up to date on this, but the top bracket for income tax in Russia was 13. They have a flat tax, I think. It's 13%. Mm. You want to go? I don't mean, Russia has some interesting strengths, important strengths, but recently, their economic system, there's something amiss there, and it isn't high taxes.
I can't believe that you're saying bad things about Russia. I mean, nobody. And by the way, Dan and I are journalists. We would not move to Russia. But But I don't know if maybe you want to comment on that. I mean, again, whether it's Kansas or maybe even, sort of the Trump or Paul Ryan model, there's a story being told about how America will recover, and the story goes something like, as long as we cut taxes, as we make government smaller, people will pick themselves up by their own bootstraps and make a better life.
This cutting taxes narrative has worked with the two great examples of Reagan in the early 80s, the first term, and of course Kennedy, when the marginal tax rate was 90%. Well, first of all, cutting the marginal tax rate from 90% to 50, was it 60 or 50? That's a big difference from that and cutting the tax rate from 38 to 25%, or even 15, which is what Trump wants to do, perhaps 41 if you count the health care. But let's look at that Reagan tax cut, which is the modern-day example of how a tax cut can stimulate the economy and even increase tax collections. Well, I happen to remember the early 80s, our generation was coming out of school and willing to do pretty much anything. So the coming of age of the peak years of the baby boomers was 80 to 83. We also had the weakening of the Soviet bloc, speaking of Russia, which led to greater American hegemony in trade. We also had in August of 1981, the IBM PC, which quickly revolutionized. Now it's anti-productive, all this stuff, but that's a different story. It made great productivity. We also had debt that Reagan took on. We had the defense buildup. All these things were happening that led to great things in the economy, and there was a tax cut. So maybe.
By the way, it wasn't that great. The growth rate of GDP was still below, for the 80s, was still below what it had been in the 50s and 60s.
Well, that's right, but it was better than what we've seen lately over 20 years. So the point, yes, you're right. So the point is maybe the tax cut isn't the thing. Maybe that wasn't the secret sauce. Maybe the secret sauce was have a baby boom come of age and invent the PC in the same year.
Do you have a thought on the secret sauce? I mean, if we consider the tax cut isn't it? I mean,
well, looking at what are America's strengths, and I think some of it is eroding a little bit lately, but it's a matter of trust and goodwill. So I was recently reading a Horatio Alger novel. He wrote novels for boys in the late 19th century. And I don't normally read novels for boys, but I wanted to see what it was like. And now Horatio Alger has been described as defining the American ideal. And they said it's rags to riches story. It's always a story about a poor boy who works very hard and becomes super rich. But I read the novel, and it did have a rags to riches story in it. But I thought it had a different quality than I expected. This boy who starts out poor is enterprising, he's considerate, he's kind-hearted, he does it for his mother and sort of thing. It seemed to be more of a book about ethics and about your commitment to society that a well-rounded person would normally conceive, at least in the environment that we live in. We don't live in an environment with organized crime dominant. We live in an environment where we do have a sense of a society that we care about. So that is the defining American thing.
But you're picking up on his voyage, his journey. You're picking up on his motivations. You're not picking up on the thing that we're supposed to in 2017 America care about, which is winning, right? He is successful at the end.
That's
right?
not Horatio Alger. You have to read him. It's not about winning. But it's like the young boy who ends up rich. He's giving it all away. He's the pillar of the community. Now, again, you might not like every aspect of it, but it's not as bad as people say. It's actually pretty good. I find myself, you'll be drawn in too if you try to read Horatio Alger.
This is another edition of Book Talk with Robert Schiller. Yes, I like that.
We're coming up to a discussion of fishing for fools here because there's a little bit more of a dystopian sense. Yeah. But I want to, what you just said raises the question about the good rich and the bad rich. And one of the reasons that Trump won the presidency against people, by appealing to people whose natural policy proclivities shouldn't have had them voting for him, that is, his policies are going to hurt them, is because he's a self-made, self-employed rich. And there was a great essay by a woman named Joanne Johnson in the Harvard Business Review about why the working class voted for Trump. Is because they hate rich lawyers and rich doctors and rich journalists. No such thing. And what they like is the self-made rich. So there's really, and I'm glad you brought that up, because there's really a big distinction in between the self-made rich and the professional rich. Now, is that a...
Yeah, in Horatio Alger, he adds stories of the idle rich. He has total contempt for them. It's like, it's the good people, they take control. They see that something needs to be done. They'll start a business and do it.
So the idle rich, like people on golf courses, those kind of people. Yeah, we hate them.
Well, I don't know if we hate them, but...
But I mean, but to continue your point.
So the question is the rise? There are certainly now more and more of that professional class rich in the economy. It's a greater share of the economy than in 50, 100 years ago. Right. And so the question is, does that parallel the rise of the danger? I'd hesitate to say dystopian, because I think that may be going too far, but the dangerous lurking world that you describe in Fishing for Fools. There's the rise of one parallel the rise of the other, the rise of professional rich, because that's what some people have written. I don't know if that's what you think.
So I wrote a book with George Akerlof, my co-author, called Fishing for Fools.
Right.
And it was subtitled The Economics of Manipulation and Deception. So what we tell a lot of stories in our book about people who appear to be unethical business people, but we're not as judgmental on them as you might expect with our title. We talk about a fishing equilibrium, where you end up being as ethical as the people around you. You can't be super ethical and survive in business, but you then show some integrity eventually. So one of the people we talked about in our book, Fishing for Fools, was Albert Lasker. Anyone heard of him? He was in the 1920s, he was one of the early marketing geniuses that used psychological marketing principles. And one thing that he did is he sold useless products. He didn't care to investigate whether the products worked. So he sold a hearing aid that didn't work at all. How you could sell it at all, I don't know. He just advertised well enough. But in his old age, he finally bequeathed his fortune, and he created the Lasker Award, which is used for medical scientists. And, so that's what we did in that book. The point is that business does look a little bit, at least mildly unethical, because that's the reality of business life.
Can you be successful in business and be ethical?
Yeah, you have to be ethical in the big picture. I don't know if the word ethical is right. One example that we give in our book is the idea of putting candy bars at the checkout of a grocery store. All right? So you're there shopping with your 3-year-old, and you come to, and now the child is very impatient, and you come to the place where you have to wait in line to be checked out, and they put candy bars right there, and they put children's candy right at eye level for the child. And parents get angry about this, and we found that there was a movement described in newspapers against this. People were angry in the 1970s about this practice. So they started taking them out, so they didn't have candy bars right there. For a while, eventually everyone forgot about it, and the candy bars went right back. And I'm thinking, is this evil? This is an example of business practices that annoy us. But now imagine that you were manager of a grocery store. Now, when you look at it, the typical grocery store has a profit margin of something like 2%. You can't fool around with you have to make money, otherwise you'll go out of business. So you might well decide, okay, I'm going to put the candy, I'm not killing anybody, right? I'll put the candy bars there at the checkout, and we'll survive to another day. I owe it to my employees, maybe. I have to keep this enterprise going. So we had Elm City Market. Remember, it was a co-op here?
Yeah.
I went there to see if they had candy bars at the checkout. And even they had gourmet fancy candy bars, but they didn't have the kids' candy.
But the gourmet at the checkout are the tiny little squares of about 2 grams for 75 cents. And if you go deep in the aisles, you can get a huge big bar for $2.99. So there's also a price component, too.
Unfortunately, Elm City Market lost its co-op status. It's just blocks from here. I recommend it. But it's not a co-op. The same thing with Edge of the Woods. You know Edge of the Woods?
Sure.
They started out as this idealistic enterprise that didn't have stockholders. And I think it was good that they started it because it's an interesting store that has a lot of things that you wouldn't find elsewhere here in New Haven. But they failed. They were taken over by a for-profit, and they're continuing. They look pretty similar. But it's little things that when you're running a co-op and you're too idealistic and too friendly with everyone, it doesn't work. You end up losing money. And in a capitalist system, you can't lose money and stay in business.
So that brings me to, I guess, another one of our narratives, Dan, from the 2016 election. So there's the kind of idea of the angry Trump voter, someone who is looking for someone to help change his or her status, and maybe this rich businessman is going to come along and do it. There are a whole bunch of other voters who are very energized by Bernie Sanders' message, but very energized by what they saw as an idealistic message of income redistribution, of the fact that the top 1% or 0.001% have all the wealth, and we need to figure out a way to make it more equitable for all. I guess I'm wondering now, a year away from the height of Bernie mania, I suppose, where we saw that narrative fall. I mean, what that looks like in 2017 America for all those people who were so idealistic.
Well, it doesn't go away. There were technical reasons why Trump was able to rise on the Republican side and Bernie Sanders was not on the Democratic side, having to do with, I know this doesn't fit into a great sort of broad thinking narrative, but the fact is that there were too few superdelegates on the Republican side to put the brakes on this, and there were too many superdelegates on the Democratic side to make it possible for a Bernie Sanders to rise. But more broadly, I think those ideas don't go away at all, and I think that anger is still there. It's on a knife edge, both in terms of the anger and in terms of which way it can go. I spent election night with a fellow who's on the Democrat or the Republican town committee in one of the Naugatuck Valley towns, I believe Seymour. And he is an underemployed surgical assistant. His father was hourly working. His father was a toolmaker, also hourly, but top of the food chain hourly. He did very well. The friend who I spent time with, not doing very well at all, absolutely convinced that Donald Trump is going to make it possible for him to get more work at a higher price. Is that going to happen? That remains to be seen.
I love your thoughts on this, because it's sort of a different part of the economic narrative than we heard from the Trump voters.
Well, I think Trump was a better storyteller and a better narrative. And I think he perceived that Hillary's story, which was more tax the rich, didn't appeal to people as much as Donald Trump will reveal your inner genius and you will become rich on your own strength. Donald Trump was a motivational speaker. He wrote motivational books. He was more attuned to what people's identity really is. So the American identity is not come to America and you will live in a welfare state where you don't have to do anything and you can be supported on welfare. That was never the American dream. It was always that you may be a talented person, but you can't make it in whatever country you're coming from because of it's corrupt and it's impossible to. The regulations aren't socially purposed. They're designed to keep you from doing anything. So come to America, the land of opportunity. The person, if you want to know what America ideal is, I recommend an article written by Benjamin Franklin. I think it was in 1780 and published in Europe for Europeans, and it was explaining America. He said, the title of the article is Information for Those Who Would Repair to America. And I recommend reading it because it sounds right today. So what he said basically is, you've been frustrated living in this feudal society in Europe. if you are someone who wants to work hard, wants to be, I don't know if he said entrepreneur, but that was the notion of it, and you can offer something, you'll do fine in America. But don't expect your aristocratic title or your family history or anything like that to do you any good at all. There will be no sympathy for you. So I think that's what happened. The American dream is people coming here thinking, I can do it. This is an honest playing field, and I'm not expecting any handouts. So that's the American.
So to continue and to see this through the eyes of our underemployed surgical assistant in Seymour, if he believes that, damn it, I'm good, and if this mess of a system would just get out of my way, I could go to work and make good money and support my family. And if he believes that there's something wrong with the system, he'll vote for Hillary because she says, we're going to make it possible for the hospitals to pay you more by giving them more money by taxing the rich. And so those are the two stories he has. But doesn't it matter that he works for a hospital whose funding is going to be cut under every plan proposed by Trump? Or did that just not matter?
Did you interpret me as supporting Trump?
No. No. My question, I wasn't, no. I'm not saying that at all.
I'm supporting Benjamin Franklin.
No, I've heard you say, in fact, I heard you in a speech said that you supported Hillary too late.
Oh, yeah, my wife and I is up there. We gave more to Hillary Clinton than we've ever given.
But late in the game.
But it was too late.
Yeah.
So what was wrong? What was basically wrong with her narrative about the economy specifically, about the things that would make someone's life better under a Hillary Clinton presidency?
By the way, she did get the majority popular vote.
Yes,
it wasn't that.
We do understand that. Yes.
Yeah.
That having been said, we are where we are, and so what was wrong? What was wrong with her? What was wrong with her message?
See, I think that this was the first time. I guess William Jennings Bryan was somewhat similar, a speaker that could get in front of big audiences and mesmerize them. So it's a special talent that some people develop. And I don't think Hillary was as involved in this kind of thinking, mesmerizing, motivational speech. Trump had been doing it for many years. And he just looked to his audience and saw what got a response, and he had maybe a better instinct about that.
And it's important, I think, in this examination of narrative economics that the narrative doesn't have to be one that is true or verifiable. You've already given some examples of that, but is there a different outcome over time? I mean, if you have a story that motivates people to do something now, but turns out in the long run to not be true and to make their lives worse, does that actually show up? Or can you always kind of get away with selling people something that they really want to hear?
Well, I don't know in the really long run that you can. As Abraham Lincoln, you know what I'm going to say.
Yeah.
Everyone knows what I'm about to say. You can fool some of the people some of the time, and what was that? Oh. You can fool some of the people all of the time, and all of the people some of the time, but you can't fool all of the people all of the time. Aren't I right? All of you have heard that? That's the power of narrative, right? It's a little story like that, which is now 150 years later, and we all know it. Just like
we didn't seem to pay a damn bit of attention to it.
Maybe some of you don't know that. Maybe you're from a foreign country, then you don't know it. But stories pervade our thinking.
Well, and you've thought about this too, Dan. The idea of stories and storytellers about whether or not the news media, for instance, or some of our storytellers have the tools and the capability to tell a certain story. It actually matters to what happens in the economy, right?
Well, there may or may not be an economy per se, but there definitely is not a mainstream media. No question. The question about the media, we feel that we are having a diminished ability to affect the universe. because of because of the way the world has become fractured. It's not online versus print, because we're all online. Everybody, NPR, everybody's online. It's a question of the fractured universe, and there are so many voices out there. But that said, either because of our sort of quixotic natures or because we think we're having a little bit of effect, we keep at it and we keep at it and we keep telling stories. And the debate in the media is whether the stories should be neutral or not, and whether there is such a thing as this myth of the neutral story.
You mean you have to have both sides, even though one side is obviously wrong?
First, yes. That's exactly the debate, yes. Whether the stories have to be neutral, as in the myth of the, what's it called, the myth of the both sides. And there are great debates in newsrooms, as you know, you're a part of it, and I fall on one side as an opinion writer, and I feel that I wonder whether if we had all been able to get the story across, we would have had a different result in November.
Well, but also, even going back, and one of the things you'd written to me is that the way in which we view a recession can be very much colored by the strength of the news media. In the early 1990s, we're on the upswing, right? We're hiring people and we're telling a certain story about a bad economic time. Different thing happened a couple of years ago.
The Hartford Courant, for example, we did experience hard times in the 90 to 93 recession, no question. There was some tightening of belts. But our peak employment was not until 94, because in a secular way, we were adding people, and that momentum continued. So much of this is about continuing momentum against the real facts. And so I, for one, as a reporter, I reported that horrible recession in which Connecticut lost 11% of its jobs differently than I reported the 07 to 09 recession in Connecticut, same place, some of the same people. It seemed much more horrible, this most recent recession. I wonder whether that was because our industry was being pummeled at 3 times the rate of the rest of the economy versus 90 to 93 when we were gaining.
Oh, so that's interesting. So the idea is under duress news media tells worse stories, therefore the actual view of the economy is worse?
It's a new thought to me. I think that the media are fundamental. In this book, I have a chapter on the news media. And,
this is irrational exuberance.
It might seem critical of you, but...
Hypocritical or
critical? I think that the news media, like I just told the story of the candy bars in the grocery store. You were under the same competitive pressures. You don't deny that.
No.
And I write a column every 6 weeks for the New York Times. So I'm a little bit into that. But I've noticed that they give feedback on how many comments you got or whether you were most read. And I found that addicting. I was trying too hard to get... And I think if your livelihood depends on it, you must really want to be most read.
I check it every morning at 7:45. The report comes in at 7:44, and at 7:45 I check it every day.
Well,
how many clicks I got on my column that day before?
Yeah.
It's real.
It's real.
It's real.
But then you have moments when you think, I shouldn't be. You look at the other columns that get high ratings, and sometimes they're junk, right?
Most of them, they're naked celebrities running across.
That's right.
You know, yeah.
So at some point you sit down and you say, I'm going to take a chance on my future in this business and do something that I believe is right. That's what...
Well, the more established we are, the more we're able to do what we think is right. But I wonder about some of the younger people and what they're forced to do.
Well, I'll also say, but before the event started, I was talking with Professor Shiller, and he had just come from taping something with CNBC, which you do often. I asked how often you do those things, and you said, since Trump got elected, they're not as interested in the Case-Shiller index.
That's right.
But what's the key, right? If you can tie it back into Trump, they love it.
Yeah, the Trump blitz is just amazing. One of my students did a count. I forget on which one of these services where you can, maybe it was Reddit or something. But anyway, one word out of every 1,000 was Trump recently.
Wow.
In one of the databases. Wow. That's amazing. How did one guy reach such a pillar? I think it's because he understands the power of narrative. So he, for example, was invited to appear on a TV series called The Apprentice. And as I understand it, at the beginning, the idea was that they'd have a number of different business people hosting the show. But Trump said, no, I want to do every one of them. Why did he do that? Because he has the perspicacity to understand that a powerful narrative is what he wants to develop in his life. And appearing on a regular TV show where he becomes this mentor of business people, it's just absolutely perfect. I don't know why other business people didn't see it, but it's something about his insights into human nature. He can be the motivational speaker to end all motivational speakers by being in such a powerful narrative week after week. That series ran for the better part of and in Celebrity Apprentice, which followed it, a better part of a decade. You know, that publicity to a certain narrative, which makes him godlike, is just very powerful.
But I'm wondering if maybe you could comment a little bit on how you've seen him interact with what we'll call, actual real business in America. I mean, a very good example is almost all of the important large employers in America, companies that we all care about, when asked, should America withdraw from the Paris Climate Agreement, to a man or a woman, the CEO stood up and said, no, we need to be in this climate agreement. We need to be with the world on this. Donald Trump, a very successful businessman himself, basically says, I don't want to listen to any of those people. What does that tell you that so many titans of business and industry and CEOs would say, this is the way forward, not just for my company, but for America? And he says, nah, I don't think so.
Well, I don't know. I can't tell you what he's thinking, but I guess it has something to do with the fact that he's being criticized for not having accomplished anything in his first months as president. So he wants to do something bold and dramatic. At 100 days, he issued a list of great accomplishments, and people laughed at them. That is nothing. On his list were naming of buildings. Something. He signed an act of Congress to name a government building.
But at the cabinet meeting last week, they talked about all he had accomplished.
Right. At his cabinet meeting.
Yes.
So he just must have felt that he'll get criticism for it, but at least it's consistent with his campaign promises. And anyway, he also said that he'll renegotiate another one. He didn't say that climate change was a hoax. He said that before, but he dropped that. And he's leaving open that there would be another climate agreement. He must have calculated that I haven't done anything dramatic. I have to do something.
But that's another narrative, though, that I think is a powerful narrative that a lot of people pick up on. It's that we can make a better deal. And I wonder how real
Right.
that is in sort of the American economy. Is there a better deal out there to be made? Whether it's about the Paris Climate Agreement or almost anything else.
Well, this comes down to the glaring fact that inequality has gotten worse, that we've made trade agreements that did result later in stagnation of wage income. That's a fact, that wage income has stagnated. And he wants to, that's just an appealing way to solve it. The problem he faces now is making it happen. And I suspect he's not so confident that he can make it, improve this.
Yeah.
Does it, in much the same way that in the election it didn't matter whether the narrative, the underlying promise behind the narrative was true or false. That is, in the hospital example, he's cutting funding to the hospital where this guy works and hopes that this freed up system is going to. So the underlying facts don't matter. In this, once he's president, do the underlying facts still not matter as to whether A, he gets anything done, and B, he's able to get a better, or will there always be some excuse and he'll always rely on the business cycle, which can go down and then back up again, to create his long-term narrative?
Well, I don't know the future.
No.
I suspect that America has a strong civil society, and they will change their mind about his narrative, but I can't say that with confidence.
I can with confidence say it might be time to take some questions from the audience. I think we've got a couple microphones that are going to come down either side, and if you wanted to raise your hand, perhaps we'll get a microphone to you. quickly. Yeah, I'll tell you what, while we're waiting for the microphones to come down here, any reaction to the Fed raising interest rates a tiny little bit today, earlier in the day, something that we knew was going to happen, but whenever it happens, now we're dealing with the reality?
This was a non-news event. Everyone expected the Fed to raise interest rates 1/4 of a percentage point. And they also issued today a dot plot which showed their consensus as to what will happen. And so it looks like there'll be maybe 1 or maybe 2 more 1/4 point interest increases this year. Again, that's just in line with what we expected. But the underlying problem that I talked about at the press conference today is the slow growth, the very low interest rates, and the low inflation that we've been having. And I didn't get any new insights about how to manage that. It's the same story that we're doing all right. We have low unemployment, and inflation is virtually zero. So some people would like that.
You know, when we go to questions, if you think you're going to get out of here, speaking of CNBC and irrational exuberance, without somebody asking you whether the Dow will hit 23,000 or 18,000 next, forget it. So at some point, we're going to have the question.
Well, so we've got a question down here. Hi, what's your name?
Hi, my name is Art Hunt, Hamden, Connecticut, and that's actually my question. Is the increase in the stock market since Trump was elected, is it based on fundamentals or is it based on a narrative? And if it's not based on fundamentals, how overvalued is it? And if it's based on a narrative, what do you think of that narrative that if we just remove regulation, if we reduce taxes, that business will be somehow freed from their shackles and the economy will grow by 4 or 5% a year?
Well, I'm a little bit reluctant to answer what is the narrative behind this stock price increase. I'm working on it. But I think that part of the problem is that the stock market increased dramatically under Obama. Ever since 2009. And so it just looks like a continuation of the same thing. But I would think that, I can think of competing influences of Trump. One is pro-business. He wants to cut corporate profits tax. He wants to cut regulations. That sounds definitely good for the stock market, if it's not good for America. And he says he wants to do it. On the other hand, I can see other sides of Trump that people feel that his election marks a division in our society and conflict, like the shooting on the baseball field today. It's alarming people. There's a higher uncertainty, so it could go the other way. I'm not very good at it.
We knew the answer was going to be it could go up or down, but it's still an interesting answer.
So if I could predict these short-run changes in the stock market, I would do it, but I don't think anybody can.
But I think to another part of the gentleman's question, though, and you maybe hinted at this earlier, I mean, the stock market of today, is it really ever based on fundamentals? I mean,
no.
Yeah.
That's been my, when I won the Nobel Prize, they put me together with Mr. Eugene Fama, who is the author of the efficient markets hypothesis. It was very difficult dealing with him at that point. But he honestly believes that the stock market is rational and as I was saying before, everything makes sense. But when I did a study of what happens after major stock market movements, it looks like they've never been predictive of earnings or economic growth. And the market seems to overreact. So in 1929 to 1932, the biggest stock market decline ever, like an 80% decline in the market. Was that correct because the Depression was coming? But I have to tell you, the Depression wasn't that bad. You don't hear people say that very often, but it wasn't that bad. The market overreacted. And that's been throughout history. So it's over. I would say it's overreacting now.
But why do we remember it as so bad? Why?
It's the power of narratives. The Great Depression narrative was not big in the Great Depression. Believe it or not, people didn't say it. Now, there were people who tried to coined the phrase. So Lionel Robbins wrote a book in 1934 called The Great Depression. But it didn't catch on. These things, they tend to catch on later when people go back and try to mine these stories.
So are you saying that John Steinbeck had more to do with my mother not spending money in the 70s than the reality that she grew up with?
I think that's right.
Okay.
That is a great question. Hi there. What's your name?
I'm Harvey Feinberg. I live in New Haven.
Hi.
Thank you for mentioning the word inequality. Can you now describe the causes and the implications for our current society?
Well, okay, the usual cause, what we've been describing, or it's been implicit in what is globalization. I should also add about inequality. Inequality is rising, but something else is happening that's really important, and that more outside the U.S., and that is the world economy has been growing dramatically fast, and life is better. I was just looking at World Bank data. Life expectancy for the world in 1960, if I've got the data, it was approximately right, was 52 years. Now, for the world, it's in the high 60s. So we're getting like 15 more years of life. And why is that? That's because of we've had free trade, we've opened up markets, some of the restrictive, all over the world, governments have seen the importance of having free market economies and trading with the rest of the world. But at the same time, in advanced countries, notably the US, it's helped increase inequality because you're competing now with these poor people who are coming up, but they're still poorer. But the other thing that hasn't been mentioned is technology, which is replacing jobs at a great rate. So manufacturing hasn't really declined in the United States. It's manufacturing jobs has declined because so much of them have been eliminated by automation. And I think that this is a dangerous trend going forward. And we have to think, it's the #1 economic problem facing advanced countries today. What are we going to do if machines replacing jobs gets even more pervasive?
But we've seen, to sort of augment that, we've seen no decline in annual increases in income. So we have the income. We're at $15 trillion, and we're going at about 4% a year gains in income. So the money is there. Isn't that half the problem? When we start to see the money disappear, wouldn't that be the problem?
Well, yeah, that's right. The real wage of wage earners has been fairly flat. I think since the 1970s, it's up like 10%. Whereas the income of the highest fraction is up, I don't know, it's gone up like 8-fold.
But the point is the economy is creating a lot of wealth. It's still creating wealth. It's not.
So we can, as Obama said, what is it, move the wealth around? That's another famous line.
That's right.
I hate to say that, even mention that, but I think maybe we have to do something like that. We have to think up policies that will, we have to do it in a good way, though, and it not in the sense of creating a sense of welfare or dependency.
But so then help us with the narrative, because the narrative is going to be important for that, right? So if moving the wealth around isn't it, taking from the rich and giving to the poor isn't it? I mean, what's the narrative that sounds right to help America get to a place where, you actually do move the wealth around?
Well, we have an example. In around 1975, Russell Long persuaded Congress to create something called the Earned Income Tax Credit, which is a negative income tax on very low incomes. That has been an important move. We also have trade adjustment assistance, which Obama actually wanted to increase that in his last budget. He called it wage insurance that would help protect people who lose their jobs. It could also be done in face-saving ways. Instead of giving you a tax break Edmund Phelps at Columbia University said we should be subsidizing corporations that hire low-income people, and don't make it as a tax break. The tax break works at the corporate level. This is a proposal that I think ought to be taken seriously. So we want to somehow keep people's sense of their personal identity and their personal responsibility for their own work.
It's interesting.
There has to be some intervention. I'm not saying necessarily, but if it continues to go as it has, such that it actually produces declines in low incomes, then we should have a plan like this ready to go.
Most of these sensible measures, along with the dramatic increase in Connecticut of the minimum wage, are faster to develop in so-called blue progressive states like Connecticut and Massachusetts, and slower nationally. So I wrote a column in 2012 when Obama came to Connecticut to celebrate the increase of the minimum wage to $10, which it just did hit a year ago, that Republicans in Connecticut who are fighting the minimum wage here should be fighting for a national minimum wage increase because it decreases the distance between Connecticut, a high-wage state, and the nation. We're still at 7.25, and I tracked the price of the stamp and the minimum wage, 1 cent to 25 cents, used to track exactly, and then the price of the stamp went way up and the minimum wage went down. So it seems like Connecticut Republicans from states like Connecticut should be fighting for exactly these things you were talking about just now, all of those, the EITC, the subsidy for low wage, the minimum wage. Why aren't they? Why don't we see that?
I want to get to another question. Hi there, what's your name?
Cassandra. I just started reading this Stephen Malby book about the man who knew, about Alan Greenspan. I'm not sure if you read it or your opinions on it. I don't really study the economy. I studied political science, but I was just wondering, because I know he got a lot of maybe blame after the crash, and I didn't know how much power people actually have individually to change policy, or if that also is a narrative.
What was the book?
The Man Who Knew, about Alan Greenspan.
Alan Greenspan biography.
Or like, what is your opinion about Alan Greenspan? Like, do you think he really had a lot of power to control what happened, like the crash and everything? Like, do you think
Is it his fault, basically?
Yeah. Like, was he like more of a scapegoat, or did he really have more control over things than other people?
Okay. Well, Alan Greenspan he was well-meaning and effective for a while, but he denied the housing bubble. He's famous for saying he didn't think there was a housing bubble. What he could have done, however, is limited. He has power over interest rates. He also is the author of the title of my book, Irrational Exuberance. In 1996,
yes,
he gave a speech in which he used the word irrational exuberance, and it made stock markets all over the world crash. So he then never used the term again.
That didn't work.
So I give him credit. He's a smart guy, well-meaning, who I think let the stock market and housing markets go up a little bit too long. He might be blamed for the financial crisis that began in 2007 after he was out.
Well, just to pick up on that, I wonder if, because so much of your work has been around housing and housing prices, how much of our narrative of the economy has to do with owning a home? The fact that for years and years and years and years and years leading up to that, creating that bubble and leading up to that crash, we all believed that our home was both a place to live and a piggy bank that would allow us to increase our wealth exponentially and go on great vacations and borrow against it and everything else. And it all sort of fell apart. I mean, what does the new narrative look like that comes from the ashes of that dream that all the Gen Xers like myself grew up with?
Well, I'm thinking of the American Dream narrative, which began to be talked about in the 1930s with James Truslow Adams' book called The American Dream. Elizabeth Warren wrote a book in the 1980s, I think, with her daughter called The Fragile Middle Class. And she described the love affair with single-family homes that we have in America as a result of, you might say, a narrative about the importance of homes in establishing status for your children. She claimed the reason we spend so much on housing is to get into the right neighborhood, ultimately to get into the right colleges for your kids, and the right business opportunities for your kids. So they wanted to be in the best neighborhoods, and they would bend over backwards to do this. That was a story, but the story seems to be changing somewhat now. And I'm not sure I can be precise about this, but now I think we're a little bit less concerned. There's more of an urbanization. We want to be living in the inner city more, at least younger people who are setting up households. They're more into social media, which were unheard of back then. So you don't invite people over as much for dinner with your wedding china and your fancy silver anymore. In fact, you just go out to some restaurant with friends. And so you want to be able to do that well. You just have to live in an urban place. So I think that the American dream or the Canadian dream or the Australian dream are becoming a little tarnished now.
Of course, and just to be fair, that dream that you described was the dream of white American home ownership because of all sorts of externalities, of political pressures, redlining, et cetera. That was not a dream that was available to people of color
Right.
all throughout American history, and that's an unfortunate piece of this, is we're talking about an American dream that was only for a segment.
Well, there was idealism about that expressed also. The other funny thing about it is that the Canadian dream is taking place now. The home prices in Canada are going, and in Australia.
Because it's all the people wanting to move there from the United States.
Maybe.
There's some debate about whether the millennial phenomenon of walkable cities and that dream is going to give way to something more traditional. Today's millennials are tomorrow's 30-somethings. At least that's the hope we hold in the suburbs of Hartford, those of us who hope to someday sell our houses.
A question over there, and then we'll get to here. Hi there.
Hi.
What's your name?
I'm Rhea Hirschman. I live in New Haven.
Hi.
This question is for Dan, and I know that you were quoting someone else, but this idea that the people who were supporting Trump of the sort you were describing were supporting him because they saw him as a self-made man, and all those other rich people who weren't. He inherited a whole lot of his wealth, number one. Number two, what makes Trump, and I realize you might not be able to answer this rationally, but what makes Trump more of a self-made person than the architect or the inventor or the attorney or the physician who starts out poor and makes, advances, gets a good education by dint of hard work and some smarts, and also rises to the upper part of the, to the upper levels of income. Why is Trump a self-made person who isn't really a self-made person, and these other folks are not?
Well, it has to do with ownership of the means of production. He owned the Trump Organization from the beginning of when he inherited it from his father, Fred Trump. And it has to do with disdain for that exact path you described of rising through the professional classes, not because that architect wasn't smart and accomplished great things, but because architects are paid too much compared to the hourly work that I do. And that's where it comes from. I'm not defending it or attacking it.
But why isn't the perception, again, I realize you might not be able to, why isn't the perception that someone like Trump is paid way too much?
The perception is not that he makes too much because he owns the company. And so it's like I write a lot about executive pay, but I never, ever, ever write critically about the companies that are owned, for example, by Intel or pick any entrepreneur who's a gazillionaire. That would be never something I would criticize. It's their company. And Trump is in that category. It's his company. And you can say that Fred Trump left him about $10 million, which is pretty good, but he turned it into $10 billion. I don't think anything good about the guy. I'm describing the narrative. I'm just telling you that's my opinion about why it works out that way, and you may have a different opinion.
Well, he cultivated, he is his own invention.
Yes.
And I think he has a marketing approach to his own career, So one thing we learned, I mentioned Albert Lasker and others, scientific marketing means it's not just reliance on psychological theories from the psych department, it's also experimentation and reacting to what you learn from the experiments.
Right.
And so Trump has been doing that all his life.
Right.
So he's tried out things that you might think would backfire. So in his books, he talks about one of his admonitions to his readers to be a success in life. He says, don't be afraid to be boastful. Or I should say, he says, his co-author wrote, Meredith McIver, who probably wrote the whole book, but based on what he told her. So he said, don't be afraid to be boastful. I've learned in life, he says this, he certainly has learned it. He's not afraid to be boastful. But he's saying, that's a success story. If you don't tell people about your successes, they'll never know. So just do it, and don't worry. People will respect you. I can guarantee it. So he learned that that is a good line for people. It gives them a new hope for themselves. I'm going to go out, I'm going to do big things. Another thing he said is think big. Don't get involved in small projects. He said you could just as well build a huge office tower as you could renovate a house. So do the big thing. So he's got lines that appeal to people who think, yes, I just haven't been presenting myself right, and I can do it now.
Just quickly, along those lines, there's a great American tradition. Facing adversity, you turn it around. Pfizer adopted the tagline, the company that has done more has done more to help more people than any other company in America at a time when it was about to pay $1 billion fine for price fixing and fraudulent marketing. And it's just that we see that on and on and on, and I think you've written about it. So,
I want to get to another question. Hi there. What's your name?
Hi, my name is Tanya Wiedeking. I live in New Haven. It seems to me that you're agreed that it is actually about the economy, and I would say the outcome of the election is also due in part to misogyny more than is acknowledged. So I'm wondering,
what?
Misogyny, yeah.
So I'm wondering, given that the narrative of economics is so rarely in a female voice, whether just the fact that the narrative is led by male voices has led us to where we are now.
I think it's a fantastic question.
Well, I thought we were going
Which
to
one of these dudes wants to answer?
I thought we were going to get Hillary as president, and but what to say on this topic?
I think there's something to that. My 90-year-old father, who went door to door for Obama in both elections, and in Ohio, I might add, couldn't quite bring himself to do it for Hillary because in his generation, he says to me, he says, well, of course he's going to vote for her, and he couldn't stand Trump, but he wasn't quite sure America was ready for a female president. And I said, you know, let's go back to, for example, Pakistan 45 years ago. How about Israel 55 years? And so, I think you're hitting on a good point. I don't know how big a factor that was, but there were a number of factors.
But one thing I'll say, Robert Shiller, that you've looked at a little bit is, you know, those narratives over time that have really impacted our economy, you know, the narrative that women weren't ready for the vote, or the narrative about the place of African Americans in society. Those were narratives that not only held individuals down, held classes of people down, but it also truly impacted, probably very negatively, the economy, our total output, our chance to grow. If we only have half the minds working on a problem and all the other half have to be doing something else, that's an enormous problem for the economy.
Well, this also illustrates the power of narratives. And to me, it is amazing what people used to believe about race and sex. That they would believe that women, for example, 150 years ago, or 100 years ago, many people thought women couldn't drive cars. How could you possibly think that? But apparently they did, and I think it's all stories. It's all we live in this is obvious to people in many walks of life. It's just, I've taken on a career of admonishing economists for not recognizing the power of narratives.
I will just say, and the microphone has gone away from you for a second, but I'll say, it feels as though we didn't answer your question. I think it's a hard question to answer. Can you just say quickly what you think that narrative is, that misogynistic narrative that perhaps led to a Donald Trump presidency, led to people not supporting Hillary Clinton?
I think you touched on it in part, that apparently it's all about winning. I would argue that might be a more masculine approach to the narrative, and yet we see, and you have explained, that actually a more sort of inclusive, embracing economic approach is more beneficial. I recognize that that's also genderizing the debate somewhat, but to me I think that plays on it, that it's somehow about winning, and no matter who you leave behind, think big.
And that being boastful in business and in all things is a way forward, and that not being boastful, which is something that a lot of American women in business have often said they have trouble with, because they don't want to show up at a meeting and say they know things they don't know. Men, however, have no problem with it whatsoever. We only have a couple minutes left, so I know we want to get to a couple more questions. So we've got a few more here. Go ahead, sir.
No.
Oh, we had someone down in the blue shirt right there. You had your hand up. Yes. Hello.
Oh, that's my wife.
I thought I'd use my maiden name.
Hi. What's in your mind?
Actually, I wanted to bring up a point that Bob has talked about, that I think I'm a psychologist, and when I think about, is it about the economy, there was so much anger mixed in with that, with the economic issues, and the anger then spilled over into other things. But one factor that Bob has talked about is that when one generation is doing less well than their parents, then you have unrest. And that's not captured maybe in the unemployment rate or the whatever, but it's a psychological issue that would affect people maybe profoundly. And thought I'd raise it.
And for the first time in quite some time, yeah, you would have an expectation that maybe you wouldn't do as well as your parents, which is a huge change in narrative.
Yeah, so the classic example of that is the Great Depression leading to World War II. So people in the Great Depression were not doing as well as their parents. And it brought in periods of anti-Semitism or anti-whatever, or nationalism that was a horrible surprise. When people have egos, and when they feel that they're losing out, things can get ugly. That's a reason why economic growth is important. It's not just that we'll have more toys to play with.
I think that ties together with the previous questioner's comment about misogyny. I would add the normalization of violence to that list as a factor, which does relate to the economy because it's connected through anger.
Unfortunately, I will say we've reached 7 o'clock, which is the end of our program. I want to thank you all for the wonderful questions, and I want to thank those of you who we weren't able to talk to. Nice round of applause for Robert Shiller and Dan Haar. But before I let you go, I'll just quickly say, please take advantage of all the things that are happening over the course of this next few weeks in New Haven. When you go to other cities across America, they do not have something that is like the International Festival of Arts and Ideas. And I hope that you cherish it, and I hope that you use it, and I hope that you experience it, because this is unique, and American cities should all have something like this. So be well. Cheers.